Hello. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. I'm Kent Hughes, your host for today's program. The economic news is a mix of the good, the bad, and statistics that are as confusing as they are enlightening. On the good news front, the American and the world economies have stepped back from a seemingly endless slide down a mountain of bad debt. One American auto company, Chrysler, had already emerged from the valley of bankruptcy, and another, General Motors, emerged just today. Combined actions of the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury have assured us as investors that no major financial institutions are going to fall into an unscheduled bankruptcy. The bad news is as clear as the rising unemployment rate. Already at 9.5%, many experts are already predicting a double-digit rate by the end of the year. Exports, investment, and consumption are all still weak, creating a near-term drag on the economy. Then there is a cascade of mixed signals. Banks are beginning to show an operating profit, but are still saddled with billions in toxic assets. We hear warnings of growing defaults in commercial real estate. One report shows housing prices beginning to stabilize in some parts of the country, amid warnings that rising unemployment will lead to more foreclosures. To help cast the light of understanding on these questions, we have assembled a panel that combines experience and erudition. I am pleased to welcome Kathryn Lavelle, fellow at the Wilkinson Center and associate professor of political science at Case Western University. Amy Wilkinson, a public policy scholar at the Wilkinson Center, who we think of as a recovering banker, and David Wessel, chief economics correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. David, let me start with you. Where are we? Where's the economy going? What's the situation?
Well, I think, as you said in your introduction, that we've stepped back from the abyss. The risks of another Great Depression, which were frighteningly high just a few months ago, have diminished substantially. Many economists think the recession may actually end later this summer or early in the fall, but the recovery is likely to be so painful that many Americans may not realize it has arrived. As you said, the forecasters suggest that we could have 10% unemployment for another year or two before we're out of this mess.
Katie, while you're really finished doing your research on a book here at the center, you've been following this financial mess. Where do you think we're going?
Well, I think that it's important to think about the future and some of the problems that we've had with forecasting in the past. And two things I think we can learn from the past that will help us think about the future have to do with the structure of international lending and how we have organized production in the firm. So we can't go back to the Great Depression and a time when we closed down our trade barriers, because within the firm production is international. But also we have to think about the fact that our lending arrangements now are such that, unlike the Great Depression and unlike the situation in World War II, we have a situation where we're borrowing money from other countries. So this makes the whole international picture very different as we go forward.
So this is a crisis with really global dimensions.
Absolutely, and global resolution.
Amy, with your extensive background in banking, you've really been inside a bank the way none of us have. How do you see things unfolding?
I think that we've stopped the free fall. I agree with what David said. I think that the banks that are existing today are probably taking smarter risk. I think they're managing in more conservative ways. I can use JP Morgan as an example. I was a banker at JP Morgan. I think that you see Jamie Dimon as a CEO that has definitely a management process in place that looks at risk. And some of the other banks that no longer exist, Bear, Lehman, Merrill, that have either completely disappeared or been absorbed by other institutions, they were chasing returns, typically. Their cultures were chasing returns. They had looser management practices. So I think, optimistically going forward, that the leaders of certain banks are probably more conservative, and they're looking at risk as much or more than they are at returns.
Well, let me turn to real estate for just a moment. Many experts see housing and now commercial real estate as being at the heart of our problems. David, I think you've written some columns on that. Until they stabilize, the banking sector will remain fragile. Is that right? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that is right. With housing, there are a few signs of stabilization. Housing has gotten so bad it's hard to imagine it could get much worse, but housing prices continue to fall, and that's bad for consumers and bad for banks because they own a lot of mortgages. But whatever progress we're making on the residential real estate thing is just being deflected into lack of progress in commercial real estate, where I think it's widely acknowledged that we haven't seen the worst of that yet. We're going to see a lot of bankruptcies among builders. We have a lot of empty buildings. It's very difficult for people who own a big building to refinance it. A lot of smaller banks have a lot of real estate in their portfolios. It's one of the big risks going forward.
One thing I would add, though, to the real estate picture is that we don't have one national real estate market. So we have regional real estate markets. So talking about how this crisis has spread across the economy, initially it appeared in cities like Cleveland and Baltimore, but now we're really talking about a crisis that's in Florida and Arizona. So rather than thinking about terms of either housing or commercial, it's also important to think about how the areas have experienced the crisis and then how they're going to get out of it.
So this is global and regional at the same time. Amy? What do you think?
I think that the commercial real estate piece is a real concern. I also hear plenty of my friends that are managing inside of banks or hedge funds or private equity funds concerned over credit cards at this point as the next shoe to drop potentially. And so I agree with both Katie and David, and I do think that with the number of businesses that we see close, that makes the commercial real estate issue even more difficult. As shops close and jobs, unemployment rate raises, that commercial real estate piece is increasingly problematic.
I think we started with the subprime problem, but with so many people losing their jobs, that's beginning to drive foreclosures. And we've got unemployment well on its way to double digits. How high do you think it will go? What can we do about it? What should we do about it? Katie?
Well, I guess if you're unemployed, you don't care if the unemployment rate is 9 or 10%. You just want a job. And so I think one thing that the crisis has pointed out is all the problems in some of these statistics and some of the problems that we've had with how do we define unemployment and how long are you looking for a job. I'm not going to guess how high it will go because, like I said, I think a lot of these problems are regional. And I think when you look at a region like the Midwest that's really experienced a lot of loss from the job industry, it feeds into these other problems like healthcare and the credit crisis in a different way than it does maybe in the national economy.
Yeah, but I think that there are very few places that you can say are really strong. I mean, one of the things that distinguishes this recession from some others is it's pretty pervasive. Who knows how high it's going to go, but you're absolutely right. 10% is just the number of people who are looking for work and can't find it. There's all sorts of many more people who have stopped looking for work or are working part-time. So the thing I think that's hard for people to understand is this is not a condition that most people have ever lived through. It could be worse than the 80s recession, and the 80s was the worst one since the Great Depression. So it may require some more aggressive government policies targeted at jobs. Some Republicans are talking about a payroll tax holiday to encourage employers to hire. Some Democrats are, have visions of the Depression-era public works employment, maybe through AmeriCorps dancing in their heads. So I suspect, particularly as we get closer to the November 2010 elections, if unemployment remains high, as the forecasters say, then we're going to hear more talk about what can the government do to get people back to work.
Let me stay with unemployment for just a moment. If you look back at the Great Depression, there were, in fact, direct hiring programs. And in some ways, if you look just narrowly at the economic dimensions of World War II, it was a massive public works and public employment program. Are we at that point where we need to be a little more imaginative and aggressive, not just a payroll tax holiday, but actually putting people directly to work?
I don't think we know yet, but I don't think the political conditions are ripe for that. I think that people are very skeptical about the government's ability to put people on the payroll, and the experiences during the Jimmy Carter presidency of people getting jobs and leaning on brooms still resonate in Congress. So I think that will be a last resort.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to change the direction slightly and say that the innovation economy is really important to bailing us out, I think. And so instead of always focusing on institutions that are too big to fail, the big banks, the big auto, government as the only solution, there are plenty of facts out there. The Kauffman Foundation a couple weeks ago released a report saying that over 50% of the Fortune 500 list in 2009 was started in a recession. Those companies started in economically tough times. And today we have a number of companies that we recognize as giants that started in difficult times. Certainly we all wonder how we could live without Google today. Other examples might be Microsoft, right? CNN, MTV, HP, Intel. All these companies in the last century were started in very difficult times. And I think that the government could do a lot more to incentivize that, which might look like H-1B visa reform, might look like matching funds, maybe put up $100 million and match venture capital or angel investment funds, which is a small amount of money compared to some of the large government interventions we're seeing. So I think that there would be ways to fuel some of the innovation.
So
it really is
not just broad-based monetary easing, but some really targeted programs that would try to get credit to the right place at the right time. Well, let me turn to something that almost everybody thinks is a virtue, that the American public has rediscovered Ben Franklin, that a penny saved is in fact a penny earned. And personal savings have gone from a negative figure in mid-2008 to a 6.5% rate in the latest report. The question, of course, is with the loss in your 201k, what used to be a 401k, and the loss of the value of your house, you may want to save even more. And you hear experts saying we may go into the next year with a 10% savings rate and a 10% unemployment rate. What do we need to do about that? Is that going to call forth another stimulus package? Is that what we need to think about? You have exports are weak, investment is weak, now consumption is weak. In a classic sense, perhaps the government needs to step into that void, and yet the politics seem very difficult. Katie, what do you think?
Well, I think that we have a classic problem here of international coordination, because the United States has played this role as this great demander in the world economy, and somehow we have to spread that out, get Americans to save more. But just as a personal investment issue, what Americans have to worry about as they save more is inflation risk going forward. So you're not necessarily safe just because you're saving more money. So the resolution to some of these problems is going to have to come from a couple of different places.
Right. I mean, basically, we got into this mess in part because the U.S. saved too little, and the rest of the world, particularly the Asians, saved too much, and they lent us a lot of money so we could buy their goods. And that arrangement was great while it lasted, and now it's broken down. Personal savings in the U.S. is a real conundrum because we do need people to save more, but just not quite yet. And that's a really hard thing. But on the other hand, the U.S. as a nation is borrowing so much now that there's a lot of benefit that personal savings is up because the government is more than making up for it.
I would also say that leverage ratios got us into big trouble in this problem. The banks levered up at extraordinary ratios, and I am concerned that the government is in that same game now. If you look at the debt, the public debt that we're taking on, your question about should we have another stimulus package, I think that we also need to be, very wary at this point on not taking and not levering up the government, which was part of the problem that got us in as banks took on leverage ratios, 2 years ago.
Well, Katie, Amy actually opened up the question of targeted lending by the Fed. And the Fed, if anything, has been more active on the stimulus front than any other institution in the history of the country. David, you're about to come out with a book. I think it's called In Fed We Trust, coming out in early August. Is the Fed doing the right thing? Has it done the right thing? What should it be doing now?
Well, I personally think the Fed did, for the most part, do the right thing. It wasn't without error, but Katie talked about the Great Depression, and one of the lessons that Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Fed, learned from the Great Depression was that if the Fed does the wrong thing, things turn out really poorly. And so he did the opposite. Very aggressive. Cut rates are now to zero, lending lots of money, trillions of dollars lent in ways in which the Fed had never before done. The question now really is twofold. One is, can the Fed do more? Should it do more? And if it doesn't, can the fiscal side of things pick up the slack? And secondly, has the Fed done things that are going to make it difficult for it in the future? We already see that Ben Bernanke and his deputy Don Cohen have been really beaten up by the Hill. There's a lot of concern that the Fed has compromised its traditional independence by lending to AIG, by being in bed with the Treasury, and some people worry that they're sowing the seeds of the future inflation. So they have their own issue, which is they want to help the short-term economy, but they also want to do things that they don't think hurt the economy in the long run by weakening their independence and flexibility.
Katie, you just finished a book on how the Congress has dealt historically with the IMF and the World Bank. Does that give us some clues about how the Congress is going to react to some of these other financially related proposals? We've just heard that...
It does make you glad that we have an independent Fed. Imagine if the Congress did monetary policy, too.
Well, this is the problem, isn't it? I think that it certainly does. I think what we learn about the IMF and the World Bank is very instructive to how we understand the Federal Reserve, because there's this time lag in financial politics between when the policy is instituted and when the benefits flow. And the benefits flow to the broad economy and not to a specific constituency like they do in Congress. So a member of Congress can certainly point to their state or their district and say, I did this, or this policy helped, whereas what the Fed does is really for the broader macro economy. And so that always makes it a very difficult political question, the same way it does with the IMF and the World Bank.
Do you think the IMF is doing a good job in this crisis?
Do I think they're doing a good job? I think that I'm encouraged by what I've seen from the new lending facilities that the IMF has added, where they've lightened up a little bit on their conditionality and they're really trying to get out there in a more proactive way. I think that the longer-term picture of the role that the IMF will play with respect to whatever financial system comes out of the crisis is yet to be determined, and we'll see it as the new packages unfold, package by package.
Amy, you talked about targeting the Silicon Valley entrepreneur, and really you're working on entrepreneurs whether in Silicon Valley or the people who found Teach for America. You're looking at the whole entrepreneurial approach to things. Should we be doing not only more targeting of the entrepreneurial sector, but are there other kinds of targeting lending that we ought to do? Should we be looking at community banks? Should we be looking at the kind of industrial banks that support John Deere and so forth?
Well, the Commerce Department has put out a statistic recently that says 99% of the business in the United States is small business. So it's mom and pop shops, it's startup companies, et cetera. So any way that we can assist that kind of small industry, I think, is important. I'm also looking at social entrepreneurs, and there are plenty of examples. Teach for America is one that is widely known as trying to reform an education sector in the United States. Freelancers Union is an interesting new union movement to give portable health care to independently employed workers, which might be, computer programmers, website designers, writers, et cetera. So sure, targeting other ways to try to support the small individual and the entrepreneurial person in the country is an important thing to do. I'll give a couple examples of the founding fathers. They were also entrepreneurs. So if you look at the history of the country, George Washington ran a fishery. Now, a lot of people don't know that. He processed 1.5 million fish annually. He ran the biggest whiskey distillery in the nation, right? Ben Franklin was an inventor. He started bifocals. He did the lightning rod. Thomas Jefferson, a farmer, innovating in farming, et cetera. So if you actually look at the history of the United States, to the very founders, we're an entrepreneurial nation. So I personally believe we should do everything we can to support that.
It's interesting. In the Constitution, one of the few specific economic features that mentioned is the power Congress has to protect intellectual property, which often is viewed as a key part of the entrepreneurial economy. But while we're on the Fed, it makes me think that the Fed, the Treasury, the National Economic Council are putting together a host of proposals for new regulations of the financial sector. Are they on the right track? And will we be able to mesh our proposals, our new regulations, with those in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere around the world? David, you've done some writing about this.
Well, I think it is remarkable the number of pieces of the economy that President Obama and the Democrats in Congress are trying to alter at the same time. We have the cap and trade system and climate change. We have financial regulations. We have health care. We have a lot of federal spending part of the stimulus. So there is an overwhelming number of things being done, and the chances of avoiding unintended consequences are nil. I think that I think that they're asking the right questions and they're touching the right pieces of the machine. Whether all the particular decisions they've made are right, I have some doubts about. I'm surprised that the president so quickly acquiesced on the question of auctioning off the permits for carbon trading. Instead, we're going to allocate them, which leads to all sorts of political game playing. On the financial regulatory front, they sort of gave up on some things. They're not going to do much consolidation of agencies, so we're going to have just as many, maybe even more agencies as we had before. And I think that their strategy, though, is that we have to get our act together, and we need to do it in consultation with people abroad in other countries, but they're going to have to get theirs together, and hopefully we'll do things that can kind of mesh. Because if we wait for an international consensus on, say, bank capital standards, we'll be well into the next crisis before we get the solutions to this one.
Amy, Katie, do you have any thoughts on this front?
I interviewed a Treasury official, former high-ranking Treasury official, for the book that I wrote here. And I have to say, one thing that really impressed me about this individual was that they kept getting back to the question in the next financial crisis. They were talking about a previous one in another country, but in the next one, how can we prevent this from harming people who had nothing to do with it? And I think that when we look at the proposal the Obama administration's put out there, it will depend on which components come together. Because for individuals who felt like they were living their lives and they just wanted to have secure retirements going forward, how are we going to protect them going forward and also allow for the kind of speculative financial activity that makes a capitalist economy very vibrant? And until we see which components actually come through Congress, like we pointed out, it can be a little bit sticky, we really won't know the answers until we see what the Obama administration fights for and what they choose to fold on.
I'm really struck by Amy's point that there's been an awful lot of talk, and it's very important, about stabilizing the system and moving forward. At the same time, there's been very little talk about what does all this mean for the entrepreneurial, the innovative economy, which drives so much of the long-term future. Well, while we're on the Fed, I am struck about how the Fed has lowered interest rates, essentially zero in terms of the short term. They have done a lot of quantitative easing, which is a fancy way of saying they're printing money. And I ran into a doctor friend who said that he is so worried about inflation that he owns gold, gold mines, and gold coins. Is he right? Does he have a reasonable worry, or where are we on the inflation front? Katie?
I don't give investment advice as a rule. I claim an academic dispensation for that we try to look at the big picture, but it is always politically easier for the Fed to expand the economy and expand the money supply than it is to contract it. And that process of contraction is very painful to prevent inflation. And until we see which political players are in place, who will be chairman of the Fed when that day comes and all, I think it's difficult to tell exactly what type of inflation we'll experience, how long it will last, and what its effects will be.
Amy, any gold coins in your chest?
No, not enough at this point, I would say. Back to the role of the Fed in regulation, I think about it, and I've used this analogy, Dave and I have talked about it before, as a freeway. So you can never take the risk out of driving down a freeway. You can never take the risk out of our financial system. We cannot be completely stable. And in fact, we wouldn't want to be. We would not want everyone to drive 30 miles an hour on country roads. We do want people to take on risk and move and innovate quickly. And so, in terms of a regulatory response, as we see driving down a freeway, you can have things on the margins and on the edges, and government can come in and regulate speed limits and put in airbags and seatbelts, and potentially, even when we know there'll be tangle-ups, have ambulances ready to go. But we can't take risk out of the system entirely. And so my concern is over-regulating, especially in a crisis and in a time when there are things to be done, certainly. But I don't think that we should overstep here, because we're not going to take risk out of the system.
It's not independent of the inflation question, because you can make the conditions ripe for inflation by basically eliminating competition and having a lot of unnecessary and unproductive regulation. Sometimes it's not intended to do that, but it does. But I think we can say that I'm comfortable that inflation is not a worry today, right? With 10% unemployment and factories operating farther from full capacity than any time since World War II, it's just hard to imagine a good inflation getting going now. The question, as Katie pointed out, is once the economy comes back, will the Fed have the political will to pull this juice out of the system in time to avoid inflation? So it's a longer-term problem, but not a tomorrow problem. So don't buy the gold coins yet.
Well, I want to not leave this conversation without sort of looking into the future a little more. That around the industrial world, the relationship between the state and the market and major private sector institutions is really changing. Here, in Europe, in Japan, elsewhere. As we go through this change, what do you see as the emerging new normal? What's going to be the relationship between the government on the one hand and key financial and other kinds of industrial institutions on the other? How are we going to deal with the next set of financial and economic challenges?
Well, if you like the analogy from pop psychology, you have to, when you have a new normal, you've gone through some kind of uncontrollable trauma, and you get back to a point where you're trying to get control over the situation. You're not necessarily recovered from it, but you're trying to get back to some kind of control. And I don't see us getting to that position of control until two things happen. Until we resolve how we're going to move the toxic assets off of the balance sheets of the major banks, and until we come up with some way of macro, international, some type of coordination of our policies. Right now we have the G8, we have the G20, we have the IMF. How are these international mechanisms going to resolve this problem? And until we resolve these two situations, I don't think we're still vulnerable to these uncontrollable shocks that make the system very volatile.
We're going to have to hold other thoughts for the future to our next conversation. That's our program. We appreciate very much David Wessel, Amy Wilkinson, Katie Lavelle joining us, and appreciate all of you for watching. I'm Kent Hughes, and you have been watching Dialogue, which is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the Megahertz Network. Dialogue is also on the Megahertz Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to the mhzworldview.org. Join us again right here next week, and thank you again for watching.